Well, welcome. Our particular class of Illuminist History is dealing with classical Hermeticism. We're going to be having three classes, of which this is the first that's dedicated to Hermeticism. Later in the course, we're going to be talking about Arabic Hermeticism. And our class on the Renaissance really is principally going to be about the Renaissance Hermetic revival. But it all begins with greco-egyptian Hermeticism, which will be our focus for this evening. It seems to me that Hermeticism contains much of the soul and character of the Western mystery tradition. It is really intellect considering intellect, light shining on light, a mirror viewing a mirror. Because of its enduring legacy, we'll be coming back to it in several different points, but this is the core of where it all begins. I'm going to begin with a quick overview of Egyptian history to give some background that leads us up to the particular characteristics of Hermeticism. The Old Kingdom of Egypt, if you start from the first dynasty and end at the 8th dynasty, runs from about 3100 BC to 2180 BC. The first pharaoh of the 3rd dynasty was Zoger, considered kind of the first of the great Egyptian pharaohs. He ruled for about 28 years, around 2670 BC. And one mark of his distinction was that he had the first pyramid. It was a step pyramid, and it began the whole tradition that we think of so much as central to Egyptian civilization of the pyramids. And the pyramids were all built during the Old Kingdom. To do this, he harnessed the talents of his vizier and chief architect, Imhotep. Now, unfortunately, the name Imhotep has come to be associated with the film The Mummy in all of its many remakes. But this is not a figure of creepy, evil power monster, but rather a figure of unique learning and enlightenment. He rose to great fame during his lifetime, not only as an architect and builder, but also in medicine. He created something that was the textbook for Egyptian medicine for ages to come, and really of learning of all kinds. And after his death, he was remembered as a god, as a son of Thoth, the great god of knowledge. And Thoth was his patron deity. And since then, Thoth, becomes very wrapped up in this tradition that we're talking about. His sayings were collected and revered in what became known as a sabbat, which is a genre of aphoristic wisdom literature that would become a mainstream of Egyptian culture from that time forward, although the sayings of Imhotep are lost to us. Later sabbats from the Old Kingdom forward are there and are particularly central to Egypt. Think of Benjamin Franklin and the Poor Richard's Almanac. The early to bed, early to wise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. Well, collections of those kinds of sayings were some of the earliest popular literature of the Egyptians. The Greeks later came to the conclusion that the god Imhotep was the same god they knew as Asclepius, probably mostly from the healing connection. The Old Kingdom functioned by dividing Egypt into provinces called nomes. You can see in this map the divisions between the Nile. These are all different administrative provinces set up in the Old Kingdom. The central administration was responsible chiefly for the storage of grain and other agricultural products, whereas the provinces supplied the administration with crops. The administration distributed the crops to the provinces, regulating against boom and bust cycles. The Old Kingdom came to an end when the provincial officers of each of these nomes became independent powers, eclipsing the authority of the central administration and leading to the chaos known as the First Intermediate Period from around 2180 to 2055 BC. The Middle Kingdom, from about 2055 to 1650 BC, was largely oriented towards avoiding the problems of the First Intermediate Period by emphasizing the divine origin of the pharaoh. This is one of the pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom, visualized as a sphinx and also as a god. So the pharaoh is divine. Everyone has a religious obligation to be loyal. And this is when you start seeing the elevation of the principle of Ma'at, not so much as a goddess figure, but Ma'at, truth, justice, balance, is the factor that holds Egyptian civilization, and indeed civilization as a whole, the universe. It holds it together. So everyone has to do their part and be fair and just and respectful. And it also, there's an emphasis on merit that led to, among other things, to a colonization of neighboring areas like Nubia. The Middle Kingdom ended with the invasion of the Hyksos. Now, records of the Hyksos were identified by Josephus later as the Jews, and throughout the time of the ancient world, afterwards, looking back on this, the Hyksos were always identified with the Jews, but it's really not that simple. They're from before then, they could be thought of as the ancestors of both the Jews and the Canaanites or other tribes from that area. But whereas the Jews retold the cultural memory of the invasion of the Hyksos and their gradual expulsion, eventual expulsion from Egypt as the weak, timorous tribes being oppressed by the powerful, evil Egyptians, the Egyptian memory was of these total barbarian, badass Hyksos coming in, invading, conquering everything, being completely oppressive, and the general impression you get are these wild, law-breaking, mighty warriors, something like the Klingons in the Star Trek series.
Hey, Michael. They were like shepherds compared to the more agricultural river culture of the Egyptians. They were like a bunch of like shepherds who came in with huge herds of goats and stuff.
Man, yeah, just not our kinds of people. But the Egyptians wound up being terrified of them, and the memory of the Hyksos rule was really dreaded. And so...
Do we know what language they spoke?
It was a Semitic dialect of the same family as the Egyptian and the later Hebrew. We sometimes forget that the Egyptian language is from the same general family as Hebrew and Arabic. There's a super family of the Semitic languages and some certain North African languages, of which the Egyptians were a part. And certainly, if they were ruling, they would have come to speak Egyptian. But they were the Semitic tribes, ancestors of Jews and Canaanites. The New Kingdom, and this is around. I should say that the occupation of Egypt by the Hyksos is known as the Second Intermediate Period, from around 1650 to 1550 BC. The New Kingdom, from 1550 to around 1069 BC, was oriented towards avoiding the problems of the Second Intermediate Period by Egypt, focusing for the first time on foreign policy. So you see the pattern here. The Old Kingdom, really in a sense, one of the things that it was really trying to do was to protect against the chaos of the pre-dynastic period. The Middle Kingdom was trying, in its emphasis on loyalty and law and order, was trying to guard against the destruction of the old kingdom by the rebelliousness of the provincial administrators, and the new kingdom trying to avoid the downfall of the middle kingdom by invasion of the Hyksos. Each area is kind of trying, like, orienting themselves around solving the previous problem. And so this is the time when you find the Egyptians emphasizing warring with or establishing diplomatic relations with the neighboring kingdoms. And so the heroic depictions of the pharaoh, the Ramesses era, overcoming the outer chaotic peoples with their heroism and daring do. But in the midst of the New Kingdom era was the rulership of Akhenaten, a mini era within the New Kingdom called the Amarna period from 1353 to 1336 BC. Akhenaten uprooted religious tradition by attempting to establish a singular cult of the sun disk, the god Aten. This was immediately reversed after his time. You know, there were, although the different cities within Egypt had their different patron deities, there was still a sense that it was all part of the same system and there was mutual respect and tolerance generally. But then Aten comes in and says, no, we're going to be all in one cult, the cult that I have dictated, of the sun disk Aten, which is a huge power grab. And so afterwards, they tried to erase all memory of him. They tried to erase all artistic monuments. I mean, you can see that this one has been destroyed and reconstructed. And here it's a depiction of Akhenaten on the left, Nefertiti, the famous Nefertiti, on his right, and their two children being blessed by the sun disk Aten. It was even a new artistic style, new architectural style, new language. But even after the traditional cults were restored after his death, the break with the traditional language and forms had a lasting effect on Egypt. While the religious language of the Middle Kingdom was based on that of the Old Kingdom, and that of the early New Kingdom was based on that of the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom after Akhenaten saw vernacular language and forms begin to weave their way into religious and administrative expression. The end of the New Kingdom was marked by a tension between the priesthood and the military, leading to a revolt by the high priest of Thebes and his usurpation by a general, Herihor, pictured here on the left. He was a general who then became the high priest of Thebes in upper or southern Egypt, being opposed to the traditional authority of the pharaoh, whose power was then restricted to lower or northern Egypt. On the right, we have Ramesses the 11th, who was reigning at the same time as this renegade high priest, Herihor. This is the beginning of the third intermediate period. So generally, the kingdoms are when Egypt is under one rulership, and when that rulership breaks apart, then we have the intermediate periods. The split between priestly power and pharaonic power is the first half of the third intermediate period. The second half, it's devolved into a series of Libyan kings, called the Libyan polyarchy. But eventually, in the subsequent late period, which says 664 to 332 BC, and that's around when the classical Greeks, the Plato and their like, would have been familiar with Egypt. In this late period, in the middle of it, Egypt was conquered by the Persians, 525 BC, and what we see here is one of those seals of the Persians depicting the king of Persia poking a spear into the back of the pharaoh of Egypt and having tied up 4 Egyptian prisoners behind him. So this was a big drag if you were an Egyptian around that time. This first wave of Persians are the Achaemenids, so the same dynasty that we see depicted in 300, the Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes of the world. The Egyptians wrested themselves from the grip of the Persians from 404 to 343 BC, only to have the Persians reoccupy them again from 343 to 322. But then in 322, the satrap of Egypt, the Persian ruler, handed his territory over to Alexander the Great. It was pretty much without a fight. In this particular slide, you can see on the right an Egyptian depiction of Alexander the Great, who styled himself as a child of God and the rightful pharaoh of Egypt, offering his prayers to the god Amun, who by this time is the most popular, most powerful of the Egyptian gods. So this is the following the death of Alexander, who died too damn early. His kingdom was divided up into different provincial rulers, and a general named Ptolemy was given rulership over Egypt, and that became the beginning of what is known as the Ptolemaic era, which lasted around 300 years, and it ended with the death of Cleopatra VII, who is the famous Cleopatra, in 30 BC, at which point Egypt became a Roman province. I mean, we think about Cleopatra from Shakespeare and the whole drama of her relationship with the Roman generals, but it's sometimes overlooked that the entire vast history of Egyptian pharaonic leadership comes to an end with her death. So it's a very dramatic moment in more ways than we usually think. It is during this Hellenistic era, from 332 to 30 BC, that we first see signs of an Egyptian Hermes in works of astrology, magic, and alchemy. The story of Hermes Trismegistus seems to arise through a dialogue between the Egyptians and their Greek occupiers. The Greeks would naturally tend to associate Thoth with Hermes, but some Egyptian stories make Thoth sound more like a god, and others make him sound more like a man. And then there are stories like that of Imhotep, a man, a son of Thoth, and yet a god. And ambiguities like this may have played a role in the rise in legends about two Hermeses, god and demigod, and then three, god, demigod, and man, and then many. It is in the Roman era, late 2nd century AD, that we have the first evidence of what we call the philosophical Hermetica, which is pretty much our focus for tonight. One school of thought is that they evolved from the collections of sayings like those of Imhotep and other wise men, gradually becoming dialogues in the Greek fashion. So this reconstruction of Alexandria, which is apparently from Assassin's Creed, it's absolutely lovely. It's from a computer game. I can hardly believe it. You can see the lighthouse of Alexandria in the foreground, and off in the background, there's the Library of Alexandria. In this setting, we have a Greek-speaking ruling class, wealthy, powerful. This is including the provincial leaders, the national leaders. And their primary spiritual expression would probably have been through, not spiritual, but their seeking would have been in the form of hiring philosophers. As we studied, Plotinus had a patron, and so the aristocrats would have had patrons, would have been patrons of philosophers, and people would have studied philosophy. It would have been one of the traditional courses of study for the elite. On the other hand, not so much within the bounds of Alexandria, but out in the provinces and elsewhere in Egypt, there were still pure Egyptian temples, but they only really communicated with other people who were of pure Egyptian descent. If you were Greek or if you were of mixed descent, you had little or no access to the ancient learning of the Egyptian temples. So what there gradually what gradually came about was this interaction between a minority of Egyptian wise people, priests, that would have been willing to interact with people of mixed descent or foreigners, and particularly they didn't have really what we'd call a middle class, but literate tradesmen. They're not aristocrats, but they are able to read. And in this particular milieu in Alexandria, in Egypt, is where we have the beginnings of the cult of Hermes Trismegistus that we later came to know. And at various times in history, there's been a lot of debate about how much genuine Egyptian material is there. But the academic opinion is coming over more and more to the fact that while there's no doubt that there's some things that are strictly Greek in them, that there's also little doubt that there is some genuinely Egyptian material in there, that there's a genuine dialogue going on between Egyptian initiates and the spiritually hungry of the Greek and the mixed Greek-Egyptian population.
Question. This
Yes.
happened during the period when Egypt was a province of the Roman Empire?
Yes, so we're talking...
They were Greek speaking rather than Latin?
Right. In the eastern part of the Roman Empire, the generally used language was Greek. On the Italian peninsula, you'd expect to use Latin, and I think in Gaul, where the Romans were occupying the Gaulish provinces, they were using Latin. But along the Eastern Mediterranean, it was pretty much entirely Greek. And they very much identified themselves as the continuation of the Greek culture. So yeah, this is a period that we're talking about probably around 100 AD to 300 AD is the likely dates for the Hermetic tracts and the cult of Hermes. Maybe lasting a little beyond that, but the texts were probably completed by around 300 AD. So yeah, the Corpus Hermeticum is the central group of texts. We call them that. It's the title given to them by Ficino when they were translated from Greek into Latin in the Renaissance. But the way, in the form that we have them, they've been edited. They were held together by the church fathers and Christian monks who would like to point out that the pantheism in them seemed to, in some ways, anticipate Christian doctrine, and they thought that it was some sign of the providence of God that some parts of Christian doctrine were allowed even to the foul pagans, which is ludicrous, of course, but if they hadn't have thought that, that they might have been completely destroyed. But to some extent, we think that the fact that they were in the safekeeping of the monks means that they've been edited. A material that was too far beyond the pale was no doubt deleted. Maybe some things were rewritten. It's hard to know exactly where the material that we have is completely authentic and where it's been altered. On the other hand, we do have this paper, Poimandres, about the name Poimandres in the first tract of the Corpus Hermeticum by Peter Kingsley, who does if you got the reader for the material for the class, and he gives in detailed analysis of why the name Poimandres, which does not exist in regular Greek, is the most likely attempt for Greek-speaking Egyptians to be able to translate the god name Pa'aime Ntere, Poimandres Pa'aime Ntere, meaning the mind of Re, the mind of Ra, the mind of authority, and is sort of depicting, as the Egyptians did, Thoth, the lunar mind, reflecting Re, the solar primordial reality. And he argues that this is evidence that Egyptian people who understood the Egyptian tradition were actively engaged in the production of the Hermetic tracts. And there's an implication there, I think, that if they're affecting it in language, that there's also an Egyptian initiatory presence in a non-verbal way that, you know, in the case of Tibetan lamas or Sufi masters or gurus, so much of what is transmitted is non-verbal. And this is making the argument that there's that non-verbal presence that may very well have been an important part of the cult of Hermes Trismegistus in Alexandria at this time. So we have more evidence than we used to of an ongoing transmission, of an ongoing lineage that is being transferred from the ancient Egyptians to the Greco-Egyptian Hermeticists. So let us begin with the first tract of the Corpus Hermeticum. Sometimes it's called Poimandres. Sometimes, let me just bring out the text here. Discourse of Hermes Trismegistus Poimandres. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to read excerpts of the texts that we're studying. Once, when thought came to me of the things that are, and my thinking soared high, and my bodily senses were restrained, like someone heavy with sleep from too much eating or toil of the body, an enormous being, completely unbounded in size, seemed to appear to me and call my name and say to me, "What do you want to see and hear? What do you want to learn and know from your understanding?" "Who are you?" I asked. "I am Poimandres," he said, "mind of sovereignty. I know what you want, and I am with you everywhere." I said, "I wish to know about the things that are, to understand their nature, and to know God." "How much I want to hear," I said. Then he said to me, "Keep in mind all that you wish to learn, and I will teach you." Saying this, he changed his appearance, and in an instant everything was immediately opened to me. I saw an endless vision in which everything became light, clear, and joyful. And in seeing that vision, I came to love it. So this is a personal narrative of a spiritual experience that, you know, we said something similar with Plotinus in his Ennead 4:8 on the descent of soul into bodies. And this may not be as philosophical as what Plotinus wrote, but it is very personal, it's very gripping, it has much more detail and richness than something like the description of St. Paul on the road to Damascus. And it's very gripping to see this early a depiction of the spiritual experience, this clear. You know, he's saying to the reader, there is this extraordinary state of consciousness, this extraordinary encounter with deity that is possible, and the writer is here to talk with us about it. So I think right from the beginning, we have something genuinely extraordinary in this literature.
Michael, can I bother you with a question really quick?
Okay, sure.
Are you reading from the Copenhagen translation?
I am indeed.
Okay. It
Yeah.
sounded a lot more modern than Mead.
Right. There's some Mead coming up, but this is the Copenhagen for now. Good and
Thank
clear. Poimandres goes on to say, the mind who is God, being androgyne and existing as life and light, by speaking gave birth to a second mind, a craftsman, who, as god of fire and spirit, crafted 7 governors. They encompass the sensible world in circles, and their government is called fate. So this may remind us of the account of the creation of the soul by the demiurge in the Timaeus, but it includes a fall of the primordial human that is more akin to Gnosticism. Mind, the father of all, who is life and light, gave birth to a man like himself, whom he loved as his own child. The man was most fair. He had the Father's image, and God, who was really in love with his own form, bestowed on him all his craftworks. And after the man had observed what the craftsman had created with his father's help, he also wished to make some craftwork, and the father agreed to this. Entering the craftsman's sphere, where he was to have all authority, the man observed his brother's craftworks. The governors loved the man, and each gave a share of his own order. Learning well their essence, and sharing in their natures, the man wished to break through the circumference of the circles to observe the rule of the one given power over the fire. Having all authority over the cosmos of mortals and unreasoning animals, the man broke through the vault and stooped to look through the cosmic framework, thus displaying to lower nature the fair form of God. Nature smiled for love when she saw him whose fairness brings no surfeit, and who holds in himself all the energy of the governors and the form of God. For in the water she saw the shape of the man's fairest form, and upon the earth its shadow. When the man saw in the water the form like himself as it was in nature, he loved it and wished to inhabit it. Wish and action came in the same moment, and he inhabited the unreasoning form. Nature took hold of her beloved, hugged him all about and embraced him, for they were lovers. Because of this, unlike any other living thing on earth, mankind is twofold. In the body mortal, but immortal in the essential man. Even though he is immortal and has authority over all things, mankind is affected by mortality because he is subject to fate. Thus, although man is above the cosmic framework, he became a slave within it. So this gives a prominent role to the 7 planetary spheres as agents of fate, and a repeated emphasis on the 4 elements. It is a framework that accounts for the coexistence of the divine and the mortal within us. So not unlike Orphism that way, that talks about the ashes and the essence of Dionysus within us. There is an element of dualism in the choice between turning towards matter and death or the immortal life. And there's also a doctrine of salvation through the ascent through the 7 spheres. Thence, the human being rushes up through the cosmic framework, at the first zone surrendering the energy of increase and decrease, so the moon, at the second evil machination, Mercury, a device now inactive, at the third the illusion of longing, now inactive, so Venus, at the fourth the ruler's arrogance, now freed of excess, the Sun, at the 5th unholy presumption and daring recklessness, Mars, at the 6th, the evil impulses that come from wealth, now inactive, Jupiter, and at the 7th zone, the deceit that lies in ambush, Saturn. And then, stripped of the effects of the cosmic framework, the human enters the region of the Ogdoad. He has his own proper power, and along with the blessed, he hymns the Father. And at the end, there's a call to save the unenlightened, similar to the philosopher who returns to rescue those still in Plato's cave. And Poimandres says, "Why do you still delay? Having learned all this, should you not become guide to the worthy, so that through you the human race might be saved by God?" And so, as Hermes Trismegistus goes on to say, as he was saying this to me, Poimandres joined with the powers. Then he sent me forth, empowered and instructed on the nature of the universe and on the supreme vision, after I had given thanks to the Father of all and praised him. And I began proclaiming to mankind the beauty of reverence and knowledge. People, earthbound men, you who have surrendered yourself to drunkenness and sleep and ignorance of God, make yourselves sober and end your drunken sickness, for you are bewitched in unreasoning sleep. So to read this tract is not only to know the story of Hermes' call to spread the truth, it is to hear one's own call to spread the truth.
Question.
Yes.
Poimandres, does he represent Nous or Nous?
Very possibly. He's a divine figure. He is the intelligence of God. So possibly Nous, possibly what Proclus calls the paternal intellect. It's a very high transmission. It's the language is more religious than philosophical. So you kind of have to draw your own map. All right, let's see, where is my, oh, here we go.
So, do you think the Ogdoad is referring to the 8 primordial gods from ancient Egypt?
In this particular case, no. I think it's referring to the 8th sphere. I mean, you know, possibly there's the argument could be made that it's both, but I think in this context, it's describing Saturn as the 7th sphere. So the 8th, possibly the sphere of fixed stars. But you know, that which transcends all the planets, or the planetary spheres, that which transcends fate.
Oh, okay, cool.
All right. So the 4th tract is sometimes called the crater, or the mixing bowl. God shared reason among all people, O Tat. I should say this is Hermes Trismegistus speaking to Tat, his son, or his student. God shared reason among all people, O Tat, but not mind, though he begrudged it to none. Grudging envy comes not from on high. It forms below it in the souls of people who do not possess mind. For what reason, then, did God not share mind with all of them, my father? He wanted to put between souls, my child, as a prize for them to contest. And where did he put it? He filled a great mixing bowl with it and sent it below, appointing a herald whom he commanded to make the following proclamation to human hearts. Immerse yourself in the mixing bowl if your heart has the strength. If it believes you will rise up again to the one who sent the mixing bowl below, if it recognizes the purpose of your coming to be. All those who heeded the proclamation and immersed themselves in mind participated in knowledge and became perfect people because they received mind. But those who missed the point of the proclamation are people of reason, because they did not receive the gift of mind as well, and do not know the purpose or the agents of their coming to be. This, Tat, is the way to learn about mind, to resolve perplexities in divinity, and to understand God. For the mixing bowl is divine. So the image of the crater here seems clearly to call back to the mixing bowl in the Timaeus, which is associated by Proclus with the goddess Rhea. So we have that, you know, the demiurge uses the crater to, just in the same way that at a party, the Greeks would mix the wine and the water in the mixing bowl to come up with the right proportion. Yeah, you know, if it was more of a letting yourself loose, it would be heavier on the wine and lighter on the water. If it was a more sober occasion, heavier on the water, lighter on the wine. But the demiurge used it to mix all of the like and the unlike and the other ingredients to make the world soul, and then each of our individual souls and that mixing bowl became quite an important image for the Platonists and Neoplatonists. And here for the Hermetists, it's back, but in a more religious sense, as that the God puts before us as the resource of mind if we as finite people dare to and have the discernment to be able to take it up. I keep bringing this back because in later times in the it seems to mix in with other legends to be a part of the importance of the Holy Grail later. So the Holy Grail becomes, of course, a devotional symbol in Christian iconography, but there is also a Hermetic philosophical dimension to it that, at a certain point became known to those who were perpetuating the Grail legend. Maybe not in its earlier forms, but eventually, certainly by the 18th century or so, during the Templar phase of Templar mysticism. But then the fourth tract goes on to say, the monad, because it is the beginning and root of all things, is in them all as root and beginning. Without a beginning there is nothing, and a beginning comes from nothing except itself, if it is the beginning of other things. Because it is a beginning, then, the monad contains every number, is contained by none, and generates every number without being generated by any other number. But everything generated is imperfect and divisible, subject to increase and decrease. None of this happens to what is perfect, and what can be increased takes its increase from the monad, but it is defeated by its own weakness, no longer able to make room for the monad. And so it's interesting here that what's written about the monad seems to correspond perfectly with the Pythagorean and Platonic doctrines of the one. And certainly the emphasis that Plotinus has on the one. And this isn't necessarily, maybe it's that it's the Platonic and Pythagorean influence in the Hermetic current, or it could be that there's an Egyptian component to the teachings of Pythagoras, even as they had in legend that Pythagoras learned from the Egyptians. And it's hard to say at this point that maybe they both come, the monad doctrine of the fourth tract and the Pythagorean one may come from a common source. So there's a lot of other tracts in the Corpus Hermeticum. They vary widely. They have different and contradictory doctrines. For me, the peak of lucidity for the Corpus Hermeticum is right at the very beginning, the first tract that we've already covered. And some of them, like the 13th, I think, I failed to see much lucidity in them at all. Some of it may be because they're intended for students at different phases of their education. And like any other movement, some of it could have to do with the fact that some people really knew what they were talking about. Other people kind of followed along and wrote with varying degrees of understanding. But it's overall a fascinating thing, and it gripped the imagination of so many of us from that time forward. Now, the Corpus Hermeticum, most of it was lost to us in future generations. Much of history, the Corpus Hermeticum was nothing but a legend. But one of the tracts, the Asclepius, we've had the whole time, at least in a translation from the Greek into the Latin. The Asclepius, also called the Perfect Discourse. There are some excerpts of it in Greek, and there's excerpts from a Latin version that we no longer have, including, and then we have an excerpt from as far back as St. Augustine of the same Asclepius that remains with us today. And part of the excerpt is, are you talking about statues, Trismegistus? Statues, Asclepius, yes. See how little trust you have. I mean statues, ensouled and conscious, filled with spirit and doing great deeds, statues that foreknow the future and predict it by lots, by prophecy, by dreams, and by many other means, statues that make people ill and cure them, bringing them pain and pleasure as each deserves. Now, this passage about Egyptians' magical statues, for some reason, really burned into the imagination of future generations. In the Arab world, in the European world, and in the Renaissance and the Middle Ages, there was this memory of the Egyptians and their magical statues as an example of what could be done by magic, how mighty the Egyptians were, what potential statues could have given the right spells. And then, I can do this. Do you not know, Asclepius, that Egypt is an image of heaven, or to be more precise, that everything governed and moved in heaven came down to Egypt and was transferred there? If truth were told, our land is the temple of the whole world. And yet, since it befits the wise to know all things in advance, of this you must not remain ignorant. A time will come when it will appear that the Egyptians paid respect to divinity with faithful mind and painstaking reverence to no purpose. All their holy worship will be disappointed and perish without effect, for divinity will return from earth to heaven, and Egypt will be abandoned. The land that was the seat of reverence will be widowed by the powers and left destitute of their presence. When foreigners occupy the land and territory, not only will reverence fall into neglect, but, even harder, a prohibition under penalty prescribed by law, so-called, will be enacted against reverence, fidelity, and divine worship. Then this most holy land, seat of shrines and temples, will be filled completely with tombs and corpses. O Egypt, Egypt, of your reverent deeds only stories will survive, and they will be incredible to your children. Only words cut in stone will survive to tell your faithful works, and the Scythian or Indian or some such neighbor barbarian will dwell in Egypt. For divinity goes back to heaven, and all the people will die deserted, as Egypt will be widowed and deserted by God and human. I call to you, most holy river, and I tell your future. A torrent of blood will fill you to the banks, and you will burst over them. Not only will blood pollute your divine waters, it will also make them break out everywhere, and the number of the entombed will be much larger than the living. Whosoever survives will be recognized as Egyptian only by his language. In his actions, he will seem a foreigner. Now, of course, this prophecy, purporting to come from a time in the distant past, in reality comes from a time when the fall and desolation of Egypt had already occurred. It's a poignant testimony to a time from the occupied people of Egypt who would have lost their independence some 600 years earlier to their occupiers. It's very likely that we see here some literary influence from the Jewish lamentations of Jerusalem during and after the Babylonian captivity. But both the Egyptian and the Jewish lamentations form an important facet of the Western mystery tradition. Other Hermetic sources exist, fragments collected by Strabæus, including the important Kore Cosmu, excerpts from the church fathers like Clement of Alexandria, Lactantius, Cyril of Alexandria, and St. Augustine, testimonies from the alchemist Zosimus, the Emperor Julian, the apostate, and as we saw in an earlier class, Iamblichus. And there are 3 tracts in the Nag Hammadi library that are Hermetic, and there are some other sources here and there. But one of the most interesting other sources for Hermetica aren't the philosophical Hermetica, but the Greek magical papyri. Now, these have the advantage of having been discovered after the Christian editors, so you can get directly to them. And if you're familiar with them, you know that they're broadly syncretic. They have many influences of Egyptian, Greek, Persian, Jewish, and Zoroastrian, everything under the sun. But there are substantial Hermetic components. And the magic in them, you know that the magic derives from the Magi, and the Magi were the priestly caste among the Medes, who were conquered by the Persians. And so then the priestly caste within the Medes became the court priestly caste among the Persians. And so what they practiced, the practices of the Magi, the initiated traditions, became known as magic. All right, or actually they were known as the magus, or in Greek magos. But the thing is that because the Medea was invaded by the Persians, there were lots of Medeans who were in exile, who were refugees, who came into the Greek-speaking worlds, and because they needed to have some way to earn a living, would say that they were magi. Maybe some of them really were, but it wasn't so much the initiated perspectives that paid the bills as wonder working, miracle working, thaumaturgy. And so the workings of tricks or spells that could change things for people and would catch interest to support refugee populations became known as magic. And because of the not always reliable motivations of the people teaching it, the Magi and the very idea of magic came to have a disreputable opinion among the Greeks. It's not as simple as all that, but there's the trend. But we see in Egypt by now, the traditions of magic and of astrology largely came from the Persian occupation and became Egyptianized, and then were consumed by the Greeks as ancient Egyptian traditional wisdom. Alchemy is a different category, really. There was a native tradition of a sacred alchemy in Egypt. Really, all of the crafts and trades were deeply embedded with an awareness of the gods and weaving the divine into everything that they did. And gradually, other things became secularized, but the working with metals continued to be very sacred and continued to be wrapped up with the mysteries. And in particular, the alchemist Zosimus from the city of Panopolis, which is a center for all kinds of interesting esoteric things throughout history. We have surviving writings of his that are very insightful about alchemy and their relations to the subtle and the sacred, and what that meant as an alchemist at the time. And you find the alchemy also in the greco-egyptian papyri. So the association of magic, astrology, and alchemy came to be known as the Hermetic trivium, as opposed to the standard Latin trivium, which was grammar, logic, and rhetoric. But you have the astrology, magic, and alchemy as the Hermetic trivia. But to give an example of from the PGM, from the Greco-Egyptian papyri, there's a piece that we've often shared at Azoth Temple. Is this, there we go. Some of you are familiar with this. It's in the 10th book of Moses. It's called the 10th book of Moses in the PGM 13. And this particular version of it, we take the translation from Mede, from GRS Mede, the thrice greatest Hermes, and it has a very poetic lilt to the translation, but he leaves out the barbarous words of evocation. So I've restored them from the Betz Greek Magical Papyri translation and made it into one text for practice. Here we go. And you can see that although it's called the 10th book of Moses, and there's a way in which it's a Jewish syncretic work of magic, the idea being that, you know, around this time, the Jews had a revolt that was repressed, so they're very unpopular right now, but the Romans are very worried about them, and there's a thought among Egyptian magi that if the Romans are so worried about the Jews, and the Jews are able to cause so much trouble for the Roman occupation, they must be genuinely badass, and their god must be one of the most badass gods out there. So Moses must be a mighty magician. So this is supposed to be the spell that Moses uses to gain all of his power. But at the same time, because it's a greco-egyptian milieu for this, it's using words that have Egyptian, Demotic, Coptic elements in them, and Hermetic elements as well. I would look particularly at verse 4. O thou who hast the heaven for head, ether for body, earth for feet, and for the water round thee oceans deep, thou Agathos daimon art, who art the sire of all things good, and nurse of the whole world. And so we have the four elements like we have in the Hermetic tracts, and Agathos daimon is well known to Greeks in general, but in particular is one of the lineage in the Corpus Hermeticum of a son or descendant of Hermes Trismegistus. Then down at, fittingly enough, verse 8, whose righteousness is never put away, whose muses him thy glorious name, and muses him thy glorious name is rather reminiscent of the muses in the myth of that we studied in the Republic, in Plato's Republic, whom the 8 wardens guard. And here's, Chris, here's your Ogdoad. And in barbarous word speak, they're A-O, Ko, Chauk, Naun, Nauni, Amaun, Amauni. But that's pretty much the same Ogdoad as in Egyptian. We would say, instead of A-O, He, Hauhet, instead of Ko, Chauk, Kek, Kaukek, instead of Nauni, Naun, Nauni, Nun, Naunet, and instead of Amaun, Amauni, Amun, Amuntet. And if you're not familiar, in the cult of the god Thoth, in his sacred city Hermopolis, his retinue was depicted as the Ogdoad, or set of 8 gods. They are 4 frog-headed male gods and 4 snake-headed female gods who are the primordial chaos, and each of them have their own particular roles. But here in the middle of this Greco-Egyptian text, we do see this element of the traditional religion of Thoth, almost completely unaltered. And then down in 14, in this long list of barbarous words, it's divided mostly into 2 large sections. After the first one, then it says of the god, and then can I highlight? I cannot highlight. Okay, of the god, Eo, Eon, Aeon, Thotho, it says. And Thotho, you can pretty much count on that being the god Thoth.
What language is this?
What's that?
What language is this?
Well, these are barbarous words, so they are supposedly passed on from one magician, the master magician, to the student magician, generation after generation, and you're supposed to recite them exactly as you heard them. And if you don't understand them, so much the better. I mean, you might remember us going over that in Iamblichus. So there are traces of sacred Egyptian, Demotic Egyptian, of Coptic, of Greek, of other languages, and they're all mixed together. And some things they're not able to make out at all. But Thotho, for Thoth, the god Thoth, that part is pretty clear. So yeah, this is of the spells within the Greek magical papyri are of all kinds of varying qualities. A lot of them are kind of dark, they're kind of heavy, kind of predatory, but others are relatively, invocational, sacred, elevated, like this. So this is just about one of my favorites from there. So that's.
I think it's really interesting how like it's really Egyptian and cryptic, and then there's this little tiny part about the power of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Just to, I don't know, are they trying to make it a little biblical so for a later audience, or I mean, I always wonder why that's thrown in there.
Right. I'm imagining that they are picturing, like, what did it take for the great prophet of this people of badasses to gain all that power? So he's getting it from the God beyond the God beyond the God. And it's not thinking of it from a monotheistic point of view at all, but thinking about like whose God could beat up my God, and whose God could beat up that God. That's who Moses is talking to. And what is that power that he's going to use? What is that invocation that he's going to use? And here I have it. If you really want all that power, here it is. Because nothing is more badass than a Jewish magus in the Egyptian.
Now, right below that, where it says great God Damon,
yeah,
it says Iao. There's this like huge palindromic word that's like used in a lot of these spells.
Abla Nathan Alba, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a number of palindromes in here. It's all very interesting.
Yeah.
Barbarous words. There's nothing like them. I would recommend this. I would recommend the Mithras liturgy, which really doesn't have anything to do with Mithras, but it's filled with interesting barbarous words and seems to have an interesting intention. A lot of these deserve very serious study. They're absolutely fascinating. And indeed, we see more and more people who are interested in esoterica getting deeply into the Greek magical papyri. So that's another important aspect of the Hermetica. Now, there's long been this idea that there's the philosophical Hermetica, and then there's all of this magic mumbo jumbo, and they're very, very discontinuous. But it's not necessarily that simple. So, because we have in the Nag Hammadi a version of the Asclepius in Coptic, and it leaves out a lot of the philosophical development and then cuts right to the juicy part. And if you wish to see the reality of this mystery, then you should see the wonderful representation of the intercourse that takes place between the male and the female. For when the semen reaches the climax, it leaps forth. At that moment, the female receives the strength of the male. The male, for his part, receives the strength of the female, while the semen does this. And we look at this and we say, is it sex yoga? Is it sex magic? And it is at least a sexual metaphor for an initiated state of consciousness. And like I say, it's interesting that in the Nag Hammadi library, which is basically assembled by and for monks, somebody like lopped off all the non-sexy part of the Asclepius to make it start at this point. So this obviously they felt was strongly worth attention. So we're in an interesting time. The health crisis that we're going through, the economic crisis, the political crisis. In this time of transition, probably a lot of the attention that we're going to be paying is to the reform of economic and political systems. But there's still going to be a role for those of us who attend to the spiritual dimensions. And so for us, now more than ever before, is the time to recognize that humanity is one spirit, that all of us are children of the divine mind, expressions of divine love, and that it is time for us to reflect back that love not only to the divine itself, but to one another. That is, and has always been, the core message of Hermeticism. That is what we need today.